Hi there, my name is Ron Rogers, and this presentation is titled New Captain, 3 Engines Out. Yeah, this isn't the way you want to have your initial operating experience when you only got 13 hours in the airplane and you're the captain. Of course, you got a line check airman in the right seat, but you're a brand new guy, and this was a rather interesting flight. Eastern Airlines Flight 855, December 5th, 1983. Now, one thing about operating over water, extended period, things like that is reliability is a factor, and you don't want single point failures. Okay, L-1011, great, beautiful aircraft. It's got 3 engines. Why does it have 3 engines? Well, in case you lose an engine, you've got 2 more. Okay, that's great. But if you got a single point failure, and this essentially was a single point maintenance failure that put this crew in a very bad situation. Now, there's other single point failures like on United Flight 232 and a 747 JAL where they lost all the hydraulic systems because although you've got 3 or 4 independent hydraulic systems, if you group the lines too close together and you have a problem, then you have a big problem. But this whole incident led into a lot of the stuff that got involved when we talked about extended range operations. And here's a little booklet. When I was chairman of the New Aircraft Committee and Airworthiness and Performance Committee for the Airline Pilots Association, we had a lot of briefings and stuff. And they're talking about how safe it is to conduct this on 2 engines, this type of operation. And good old Chet Extrand, who we had a good relationship together. He was the Boeing vice president. He's the guy who is on this little thing I showed you here, the presentation. Now, of course, we're sitting in this presentation. They talk about, 4-engine aircraft have a higher failure rate because you've got 4 engines. You're got a greater chance of losing one than a 3-engine aircraft. And a 2-engine aircraft has even less failure rates than a 3 or 4-engine aircraft. So I said to Chet, well, that's really great. Let's go to 1-engine aircraft and we'd cut that engine failure rate in half. And he looked at me and he kind of saw that, the argument, that's not where they wanted to take the argument, but it was a valid point. And if you have 0 engines, you will never have an engine failure. So, hey, what can you say? But let's talk about this little flight here. It occurred on May 5th, 1983. It was an Eastern Airlines flight that was going from Miami down to Nassau in the Bahamas. That's 187 miles or so. It's a nice, quick 37-minute flight. And but it didn't go quite as well as the crew had intended. And it had to do with a single point maintenance failure. Now let's talk about the flight. It's Flight 855 departed runway 27 right at 8:56 in the morning out of Miami International Airport. They had 162 passengers and a crew of 10 on board. It was an instrument flight rules flight down to Nassau in the Bahamas with an estimated en route time of 37 minutes. At the time, the new captain, the guy with 13 hours, was sitting in the left seat there. He had a line check airman sitting in the right seat, and this is kind of interesting. The guy only had 282 hours on the L-1011. That's awfully new for the way at least we did line check airmen's later. They wanted you to have thousands of hours. In fact, I think I had 20 when I checked out as a 777 LCA. I only had 2,500 hours in the airplane and wanted to have 3,000, and because of my flight test activities on the 777, they were more than happy to waive that. The flight engineer was the most experienced guy there. He had been on for quite a few years. So these guys take off. Now, they stated that the takeoff and the climb up to flight level 230 was uneventful, and the flight engineer was monitoring the various systems. Now, I think the accident board was a little unfair on this flight engineer because he's got a lot of extra duties to do, and he's got interface with the flight attendants. They've got things they want. They've got passenger issues, stuff like that. He's got to operate the pressurization systems. He's got to make verbal reports. This is before the automatic reporting system. You actually have to get on the radio radio, and you have to call back to the station after report out and off times and fuel and all this stuff. So that's an extra little duty. Well, that's a nice reason to have 3 people. You got all these extra duties. The other thing about it, and it's kind of strange for me to say this, but this is where an aircraft designed for 2 people is better, because they faulted the engineer without virtually continually monitoring the instruments. Now, if you've got an automated aircraft like, the 767s, the 777s, Airbus 320, anything like that, if you have something that goes out of whack, you're losing oil quantity, oil pressure, you get notified immediately. And that's one of the nice things, is there's no delay in letting the crew know that you got a problem. You don't have to wait, not to put flight engineers down, because I was one, but you don't have to wait for the flight engineer to stumble upon it. And they kind of chided him for that, the NTSB, which I think was a little unfortunate. But okay, he's checking the instruments going through 1,500 feet. He called Eastern Operations and told him what was, the departure times and stuff like that. And he looked at the oil quantity gauges, and they looked normal. Then at about 9:08, they leveled at flight level 230, and about 9:10, they were cleared to 9,000 feet. These short flights like these are in a big aircraft are a lot of fun. So they start their descent, and at 9:11, the flight engineer contacted NASA Approach, and they were descending through flight level 200, and they're 70 miles from NASA. NASA Approach Control reported the weather ceiling was 1,000 feet broken, visibility 5-mile ceilings to the east, and to the south was 5 to 800 feet, and thunderstorms to the north. Typical, weather in that area. NASA Approach Control informed Flight 855 that it was following a light twin-engine airplane, which is about 30 miles ahead of it. All right. The flight engineer put together the landing card and read the descent and in-range checklist preparation for landing. He stated that he also received requests from the cabin attendants for routine items involving the passenger's arrival at NASA. The flight engineer stated that he did not scan his panel or oil quantity or pressure gauges for about 5 minutes, and that's not unreasonable because he had these duties to do. During that time, he sits at a small desk, of course, in front of the engineer's panel, and the oil pressure and quantity gauges were at eye level. The way they write the report, the gauges were right in front of you. Why didn't you didn't notice it? Well, I think they're a little hard on the engineer. Now, it's not a whole lot of distance between Miami and NASA, and they were descending through 15,000 feet, and the captain informed the flight engineer that the low oil pressure warning light was on for the number 2 engine. The flight engineer stated at this point that he had finished the in-range call and landing data card, and he looked at the oil quantity and pressure gauges, and he saw that the number 1 and the number 3 indicated about 15 quarts, and the oil pressure in the green or acceptable range. However, the number 2 engine indicated a quantity of 8 quarts, and pressure was fluctuating between 15 and 25 psi. The flight engineer was not concerned with the quantity indication, since he stated that he expected to see fluctuations up to 3 quarts on either side of 18 quarts. However, he had never seen an oil pressure problem with the L-1011. The flight engineer then advised the captain that the oil pressure on the number 2 engine was fluctuating between 15 and 20 psi, and that the minimum pressure required for normal engine operation was 30 psi, and that the oil quantity gauge for the engine was reading 8 quarts, while the other 2 engines were indicating about 15 quarts. Now, the captain ordered the flight engineer to shut down the number 2 engine, and the captain started the auxiliary power unit. That was a very good thing to do, which would come to his aid later in this event. Okay. At 9:15, while at 12,300 feet, the captain requested clearance back to Miami. Now, you might wonder about that. Here we are coming into land, and he wants to go back to Miami. Well, he basically figured that given the weather conditions and things like that, and following the other aircraft, and this was non-radar environment, that the time to get on the ground back at Miami, which was VFR, instead of having to shoot a two-engine instrument approach down to Nassau in a non-radar environment, that he felt, it's better to go back to Miami. And the board, which of course always likes to second guess you because they have that option because the whole situation is over, they actually concurred that, yeah, that made a lot of sense. So at 9:15, Flight 855 was cleared to make a 180-degree turn, maintain 12,000 feet. And at 9:18, Flight 855 contacted Miami Air Route Traffic Control Center. And at 9:18, the flight was cleared to flight level 200. During this time, the flight engineer completed the engine shutdown checklist, secondary items on the emergency checklist. And he said that these tasks require about 4 minutes to complete, so he wasn't constantly monitoring the indications on engines number 1 and 3. This is where it gets interesting. As the airplane climbed through 15,000 feet, the oil pressure light for the number 3 engine illuminated, followed by illumination of the light for the number 1 engine. At that time, the oil quantity gauges for all 3 engines read 0. Okay, at 9:23, with the airplane level at 16,000 feet, they informed air traffic control about the readings and indicated that they felt it was a faulty indication. Because what were the chances of all three engines having 0 oil indication? The flight engineer contacted Miami Airlines maintenance personnel to determine if there was a common electrical source which could affect the engine instruments, and there was. It was AC bus number 2. So, okay, problem with AC bus number 2, that makes sense. He goes and he checks the circuit breaker. Circuit breaker's fine. Okay. Well, they're starting to get concerned about this because at 9:28, the number 3 engine failed. The airplane was about 80 miles from Miami, and it began a gradual descent. The flight crew stated that they realized that at that point that the indications of 0 oil pressure and quantity were correct and not a gauge problem. Now at 9:29, Miami Air Traffic Control cleared Flight 855 to descend to any altitude required and fly directly to Miami International Airport. That's the nice thing about having an emergency. They get everybody out of your way. And they cleared them to land on 27 left. The flight engineer called the senior flight attendant to the cockpit and instructed her to prepare the cabin for ditching. The senior flight attendant, in turn, briefed the other flight attendants who were then doing pre-ditching procedures. Now, the board faulted the crew and the engineer because they didn't give the flight attendants timely instruction. And the captain, or nobody actually, ever talked to the cabin except to announce that ditching was imminent. And there was a lot of pandemonium back in the cabin. The people were panicking, basically. The flight attendants tried to get able-bodied people to assist in the ditching, and a number of people refused. Other people were too drunk to assist. 37-minute flight and you're already snockered. Okay, a lot of people had trouble getting the life vests out of the plastic containers and putting them on, and especially in the seated position. And then the crew had never really communicated well how much time it was going to be before they were actually going to hit ditch in the water. So the passengers were in the brace position for 9 to 10 minutes, which of course, if you've ever practiced that or experienced it, it's an extremely uncomfortable position bent over like that, and that caused a lot of consternation. And of course, a lot of the passengers hadn't paid attention to that safety briefing before they left and had trouble putting on the life preservers and weren't quite sure how to use them. So that's why it's always good to pay attention when the flight attendants talk to you. Okay, well, the flight crew attempted to restart the number 2 engine but was not successful. And at 9:33, the number 1 engine failed. The airplane was about 12,000 feet above the ocean. The rate of descent was about 600 feet per minute with 1 engine operating, and it increased to 1,600 feet with no engines operating. Now, here's where the captain was wise in turning on that APU, because the APU provided hydraulic pressure and electrical power to the airplane once all the engines stopped operating. As a result, the flight crew had the ability to operate all the controls in the airplane despite the total loss of engine power. At 9:33, Flight 855 advised Miami that no engines were operating. The airplane was about 55 miles from Miami. Shortly thereafter, the flight engineer announced over the public address system that ditching is imminent. But the people remained in the brace position for the 9 minutes till they actually touched down. The senior flight attendant assumed that the airplane was about to enter the water and instructed the passengers to assume the brace position. Now here's where it gets kind of interesting with crash rescue sort of operation. The Coast Guard and other potential rescue vessels were notified of the emergency, and the initial notification was made to Coast Guard District Headquarters at 9:28. Of course, a Coast Guard Falcon jet and a helicopter immediately departed the Coast Guard station at Opelika, Florida. At 9:33, the helicopter and a C-130 were airborne, both of which were already in flight out of a naval air station and they diverted to assist Flight 855. Additionally, they had 3 more Coast Guard helicopters and another Falcon jet were alerted and prepared to respond to an emergency. So these guys are going to have a lot of good coverage if they went down. 1 Coast Guard cutter and 5 other patrol vessels were standing by at sea. Air Force C-130 and a helicopter, both from Homestead Air Force Base, were alerted and were preparing for takeoff. All aircraft and surface vessels were alerted and either underway or preparing to get to the flight by 9:40. The captain attempted to restart the number 2 engine for a second time, but was unsuccessful. He then attempted to start numbers 3 and number 1. At least the guy was, he was dedicated. He was going to try to get something going here. But again, he was unsuccessful on starting 1 and 3. They were processing through the ditching checklist, and the captain then attempted a third time to start the number 2 engine. At 9:38 and 18 seconds, the number, with the airplane at 4,000 feet and an indicated airspeed of 250 knots, the number 2 engine restarted. And the number 2 engine with that duct up there, you're going to have a lot of duct loss, airflow loss. So it's interesting that was the one he was able to get started. The airplane was about 22 miles from Miami. The descent was arrested about 3,000 feet. And at 9:40, they started a gradual climb to 3,900 feet. They leveled at 3,900 feet and began their preparations for a final descent into Miami. The flight attendants and the passengers remained in the brace position until just before landing, and the captain announced they would land in Miami. At 9:46, the aircraft landed. Air traffic control reported to the captain after the airplane landed that smoke was emerging from the number 1 engine. The captain discharged the fire bottles in the engine and the smoke stopped. He later discharged fire bottles in the number 3 engine after smoke was reported by ground personnel. Because the airplane could not be taxied on the power generated by the number 2 engine, it was towed to the gate and passengers deplaned normally at the terminal. And all this, fortunately, was conducted in daylight hours. Now, this is a picture of the Rolls-Royce engine, and here's where the issue comes in with the chip detectors. Now, they have these little chip detectors. They have a magnetic probe that picks up little pieces of metal in the oil system, and the whole purpose of this is to determine that if you've got a problem with the engine. When you dump oil on reciprocating other engines like this, you check for metal, and you can run oil analysis to see particles that you wouldn't normally see with your eye. If you're actually picking up pieces of metal on the probe there, you've got a fairly serious problem. And a lot of times you'll get an indication of an impending failure of some sort of or another, depending on the metal that you're picking up. And when you do the analysis, they look for nickel, copper, various things like that. And these components are made up of various alloys. And they'll see like a copper value or a nickel value or something like that. And they'll go, well, we know that's a bearing or that's some other aspect that could be causing an issue. And the problem was maintenance Normally they went to the supervisor's office to get these probe detectors to replace, and they replaced them quite often. But this time the supervisor didn't have them in his little drawer, so he had to go to supply. Well, in the process of going to the supply, the O-rings were not situated on these probes. And that's where the whole problem comes in, because without the O-rings, the oil just pumps right out of this little connector here. Now, the FAA faulted Eastern Maintenance for the mechanics for not following the cards well, and the FAA was also cited for not proper oversight of the Eastern Airlines maintenance procedures. Now, this wasn't the first time this happened. It was the first time it happened to all three engines where they replaced one of these probes without the O-rings, but it was the 13th occurrence of this problem. All of the other occurrences either resulted in only one engine being shut down or no engines being shut down. And the interesting thing about this is with normal ETOPs procedures now, one mechanic doesn't service both engines. It's two different mechanics. But in this case, one mechanic serviced engines 1 and 3, and another mechanic, because he had to get on a step ladder and that to service engine number 2. It was a separate mechanic, but they all missed that there were no O-rings on this probe, and they only motored the engine for about 10 seconds, which they determined later was not long enough to see you had an oil problem. It took about a good 20 seconds of motoring to get the oil far enough into the system where it would start leaking out of this probe. So they later changed the procedure to you motor the engine for 30 seconds, but not over 2 minutes. So it was a maintenance issue and a single point failure, if you will, that led almost to a disaster. And like I said, that's not the type of event you want to have on your initial captain checkout in a new airplane. Very, very embarrassing there. So whatever happened to this aircraft? Well, the aircraft, which was November 334EA for Eastern Airlines, was repaired and returned to service. The aircraft would later fly for Air Algérie in 1989 before being leased to American Transair the same year. Following Eastern Airlines ceasing operations in 1991, the aircraft would be transferred to Delta Airlines and re-registered as November 788DL, and the aircraft would later be transferred to Tradewinds Airlines in 1997, being registered as November 826CR. And then finally, the aircraft was scrapped at Greensboro in March of 2004. So that's a tale of not the sort of thing you want to happen on a new flight as a new captain. Single point failures, how maintenance procedures are developed, but if they're not carefully followed, you can have issues, and just a rather unpleasant event. And it was interesting. The report said there was a lot of pandemonium in the cabin, passengers panicking, screaming, and the lack of communications or timely communications between the flight attendants and the crew. But they were busy. But that's one of the important things is you do have to make sure that the flight attendants know just how much time they have. Anyway, I hope you found that informational, interesting, and informative. And thanks for watching.